来宾早安。
Good morning, everyone.
谢谢大家今天再次来参与2015身心障碍者的权利公约国际研讨会。那上午的议程即将要开始，在这里要跟大家说明以下的注意事项。
Thank you for coming back for the second day of the conference. We have a couple reminders.
首先，请将您的手机拿出来，
Take out your cell phone.
确认一下有没有关上静音。
Make sure you turn them off, and or vibrate.
好，接着呢，跟大家报告，洗手间在会场的两侧。那么无障碍厕所呢，在会场外面的咖啡厅柜台的右侧，以及1楼的男厕所旁边是各有一间的。那么在1楼的大门左侧，我们另外备有2间无障碍的流动厕所。
Restrooms are on both sides of this auditorium. Gender-neutral wheelchair-accessible restrooms are on the right-hand side of the cafe and next to the men's restroom on the first floor. There are 2 additional gender-neutral accessible porta potty on the left-hand side of the lobby entrance.
在报到处的地方呢，我们有瓶装的矿泉水，如果有需要的话，可以到报到处向工作人员索取。
We have provided bottled water for everyone at the check-in desk.
在现场，我们佩戴黄色的识别证的呢，都是我们的工作人员。如果您有任何的问题的话，都可以随时提出来。另外，我们有2位活动助理，请2位活动助理到台前来好吗？我们的汉庭跟雅萍，好，往前，让我们知道您在哪里。
If you have any questions, please reach out to our staff with yellow badges. We have 2 personal assistants who will be able to provide individual help.
不要觉得不好意思，尽量麻烦他们，他们会一直待在您的左手方的位置，协助所有的与会者，包含取物、取餐、倒厨余、用餐。那么现场我们备置一台移位机，在1楼的无障碍厕所。那么我们提供需求者来使用，2位助理呢也会提供就是使用移位机。好，请回座。在左手边呢，如果有人找不到他，或者是中场进来，然后不知道我们的2位助理在哪里，也请旁边的朋友协助提醒一下哦。好的，我们现在就要开始进入这次的研讨会第3场的主题演讲。我们欢迎主持人国立师范大学特殊教育学系王小来教授。主讲人 Director Sylvia Judith Cranston。主讲人将进行45分钟的演讲，我们会保留15分钟的问答时间。在这里要提醒所有的与会者，在您提出问题的时候，尽量注意您的提问时间，因为我们有很多的人都希望能够参与其中，所以尽量缩短您的提问精简一下哦。那么在您提问之后呢，也希望您将您的提问内容就是写在您的手册后方的发言条，交给身旁的工作人员。那如果你这次真的来不及提问的话，你也可以写在发言条上，然后交给工作人员，我们将会留下书面的意见，然后列入记录当中。那么提醒就是所有的与会者还有所有的贵宾们，今天就是我们会在就是演讲结束的5分钟前会按1声的铃声，那么在时间到的时候我们会按3声的铃声。那么如果你还继续一直讲的话，我们就会不断按铃，然后还会举牌通知。那么请主持人协助我们控制好时间，谢谢。
Now we will begin the 3rd keynote presentation. Speaker Sylvia Quinn, Director of Guatemala's Disability Social Audit Commission, will give a talk for 45 minutes, following by a 15 minutes Q&A. Professor Xiaolan Sharon Wang of National Taiwan Normal University will be the moderator. The presentation, sorry, I spoke of that already. When making comments, please state your name and affiliation. It is likely that we won't be able to take everyone's questions and comments. Please write down your thoughts on the blank sheet in the back of the conference brochure and submit them to the staff. We will include your thoughts for future discussion. Sylvia, we will ring the bell 5 minutes before your time is up. We will then ring the bell 3 times at the end of your presentation. Thank you.
请王教授开始。
谢谢。Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We have a very strict time limit, so let's just start it. And I will very briefly introduce our third international speaker, Ms. Sylvia Judith Quan. I'm personally very impressed by Sylvia's contribution and efforts on the promotion of human rights of persons with disabilities and some gender issues. She's now the director of the Disability Rights Advocacy Unit at Guatemalan office and represent the office at the National Council for the Disabled. She's very experienced and professional, especially in the issues of disability rights and some gender's issues as well. Sylvia is working very actively and worldwide. She ever joined United Nations to draft the CRPD, and she collaborates with NGO of persons with disabilities and families. And she has been nominated as a member of Disability Rights Fund's Global Advisory Panel to support people with disabilities and to give grants to some organizations over the world. So we believe that she is one of the best to help us understand the content and significance of the CRPD. Let's welcome Sylvia.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. I am a bit nervous about this lecture. I know that all of you are very familiar with CRPD, so I really wish I can make new contributions to what you already know. So I'll try not to be boring. Basically, what my presentation is about is how, as a state that has ratified CRPD, policies and legislation at the domestic level can move forward with the international standards provided by CRPD. So my presentation is based upon the experience that I have had as a member of the CRPD committee at the UN level, although today, of course, I'm in my personal capacity. But I thought this would be valuable as a contribution to the work that you're doing in Taiwan. So I'm going to go through these general facts about CRPD and its optional protocol that probably you already know. It was adopted by the General Assembly of the UN in December of 2006. As of today, I think there is 160 states parties to CRPD and 88 states parties to the optional protocol. The basic, I'm sorry, how do I let you know that we have to change slides? Just say next. Okay, sorry. Okay, so basically the CRPD, its main contributions to the Human Rights International or the international human rights field is that it is a paradigm shift from the medical perspective to the human rights perspective. That is stop considering persons with disabilities as persons who have to be taken care of in a medical or a therapeutical sense, but rather consider persons with disabilities as subjects of rights. The definition that the CRPD provides in Article 1 makes an emphasis that disability is basically an interaction between the person as an individual and the barriers that are in the environment. Okay, so in the next slide, CRPD is a fundamental and comprehensive human rights treaty. It includes all rights, that is the civil and political rights, but also the economic, social, and cultural rights. And it has a very strong focus on combating and eliminating discrimination based on disability. It is also an instrument for development, and this is something we consider innovative in a human rights treaty. And it also includes a provision on the importance of international cooperation to achieve full compliance of CRPD. And an article, and this is in the Universal Human Rights Treaties, that is the core human rights treaties that have been adopted at the UN. This is the first treaty that has included a provision in relation to the national implementation and monitoring of this convention. Okay, so in the next slide, what are the key issues in CRPD and its implementation? There is a need for legal harmonization, and that means to domesticate CRPD. We need not only disability-specific legislation that is compliant with CRPD, but we also need to review the overarching framework that recognizes the rights of persons with disabilities. There is every piece of legislation where the rights of persons with disability might be included or might be violated in certain topics, have to be revised and modified in order to comply with CRPD. So this is actually a very long task. So as committee, what we have recommended is that a plan has to be drafted, because changing one piece of legislation might not be too complicated, just one piece, but if we're thinking that we have to review whole legal framework. Of course, a plan has to be drafted with concrete steps and, of course, a timeline. And, of course, this is applicable at all levels in the case where the state is a federal state, which is not the case of Taiwan, but at national, regional, and provincial levels, of course. Okay, in the next slide, there is this very important issue, which is the consultation mechanism with the persons with disabilities and their representative organizations. And this is actually set in Article 4, Paragraph 3 in a general manner. But it is important that when this consultation is undertaken, the state includes all cross-disability organizations, and especially those organizations that represent the interests or persons with disabilities who have been more marginalized, for example, women and children with disabilities, and those organizations representing disability minorities, like those with multiple disabilities, psychosocial disabilities, other minorities like persons with disabilities in rural areas, for example. So in the next slide, we go to the next issue, which is equality and non-discrimination. And a lot of this has been already discussed yesterday, but it is important also to point out that disability-based discrimination should be identified, recognized, and in some way punished. And there is another dimension that CRPD has mentioned also, which is multiple and intersectional discrimination, which most anti-discrimination legislation around the world does not recognize. So this is something also that it is important to consider when reviewing policies in relation to combating discrimination. And of course, what already has been said yesterday, that denial of reasonable accommodation should be considered disability-based discrimination. Okay, so in the next slide. This also is very important. CRPD includes especially marginalized groups within the disability community, and that is women and girls with disability. And within women and girls with disabilities, there are several issues to be considered. First of all, that women and girls with disabilities should be considered in policies and legislation aimed at women in general, women and girls in general. But also, there should be a gender focus or gender perspective in the disability-specific policies and legislation. Another issue that is in Article 16 of CRPD about protecting persons with disability against violence, exploitation, and abuse. It has a strong mention to the vulnerability that certain groups of persons with disability have to be protected. For example, women, children, of course, and other groups like older persons with disabilities. So in this sense, when we talk about women and girls with disabilities, there should be a special consideration when protecting the rights of women and girls against violence, exploitation, and abuse. Also, the issue about accessing sexual and reproductive health services, and accessibility to all kinds of protection schemes for women against violence, exploitation, and abuse. I want to maybe elaborate a bit on this issue. Many times when we talk about violence against women and we look at the protection mechanisms that countries have, we notice the lack of disability perspective in those protection schemes. Of course, there are several considerations, like mostly the testimonies of women and girls with disabilities, but in particular with some types of disabilities, like psychosocial or intellectual disabilities, have very little credibility. And usually law enforcing officers like police, prosecutors, just do not think that prosecuting a claim or a complaint against placed by a woman or a girl with a disability is really important. So there is, of course, an under-registry of complaints placed by women and girls who have been subjected to violence, but also those that do go forward have very little access to the schemes to have their rights protected. For example, shelters for women who have been victims of violence rarely are accessible. There is rarely sign language interpretation in the institutions, but also in shelters. And access to justice is so complicated. And of course, there is another issue that plays a key role in these procedures, and that is for those women and girls with disabilities whose legal capacity has been denied, access to justice is almost impossible. So in the next slide, we see that there's another especially marginalized group which the CRPD mentions, and that is children with disabilities. And when considering children with disabilities, the CRPD emphasizes on the right that they have to live in their family and not to be abandoned, which is something very common, still widespread around the world. That they should also have equal access to education, cultural recreation, of course, to all rights that other children have right to. And something very important is that they have also a right to express their opinion. And for this, mechanisms should be placed so that they have the real possibility to express their opinions. In the next slide, in relation to accessibility, accessibility is not a human rights by itself, but of course it is a means to achieve the rights of persons with disabilities. And it's very interesting when you go through what accessibility means and what are the settings where it should be applied on, because it does affect not only civil and political rights, but also the economic, social, and cultural rights. So it has those two dimensions, and it means that accessibility is necessary to comply with immediate rights, those are the civil and political rights, but also to comply with progressive rights, the economic, social, and cultural rights. So it is very interesting when you analyze how to implement full accessibility in a state party or in a country X. Like accessibility is not immediate sometimes, or most of the time. So plans actually have to be designed with concrete stages and timelines to make all kinds of environments accessible, because we're talking about public and open facilities that are open to the public. Accessibility also includes information and communication. It's not only the physical environment that we're talking about, and that is something that many times advocates forget about. Okay, so in the next slide, we look at awareness raising. It's usually something that many organizations and many public institutions say they do, but it is very important to know that when we talk about awareness raising, we are, of course, talking about awareness raising with a disability rights perspective and not medically or charity-based awareness raising. So the question that we usually ask is, where does the government funding that is allocated to awareness raising go to? What kind of campaigns are being promoted? Are these campaigns rights-based or medically or charity-based? So it is important that, of course, those who promote or who design the awareness-raising campaigns or education programs are aware that prevention of disability is not considered rights-based disability awareness raising, for example. Of course, awareness raising does include mass media, but also the aim to eliminate stereotyping, disability stereotyping through education. Of course, we're talking about long-term education. Okay, so in the next slide, we're coming to the most complex topics. Legal capacity should be fully recognized to all persons with disabilities without exceptions. Article 12 of CRPD also establishes the need for states to provide for the necessary assistance that people with disabilities would, in some circumstances or situations, require to exercise their full legal capacity. And I would say that Article 12 of CRPD is the most emblematic article in CRPD that shows the paradigm shift from the medical model to the rights-based model. And basically, the paradigm shift can be translated into the idea that the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities or the actions that are promoted in relation to persons with disabilities are undertaken under the principle of the highest interest of the person with disability. That is a medical model. And the shift is that legal capacity respects the will and preference of the person. So the person basically has the capacity to decide for him or herself, or has the mechanisms to express his or her will and preferences. Of course, there is a need also to provide legal safeguards to protect persons with disabilities from undue influence from third parties that could provide the assistance. So where, well, we can think of many examples in this sense, but basically we're talking of an independent authority like a judge who can review periodically whether the assistance that has been, the assistance and support provided to a person with disability in order to exercise their legal capacity is not exercising undue influence on that person. And something that is very important to keep in mind is that usually when we think of persons with certain types of disabilities, especially psychosocial and intellectual disabilities, who are the most frequently denied their legal capacity, is that there is this stigma that they do not have the mental capacity. And it seems like mental capacity is a synonym to legal capacity. And basically, we can just say that it's not definitely a synonym. Well, mental capacity is something that can be assessed very subjectively. Legal capacity is very objective. And so it should never be considered as a synonym when we think if whether a person should or should not have legal capacity, we think of their mental capacity. So mental capacity is something very subjective, and it can change from time to time, while legal capacity is an objective attribute that has to be granted as the recognition of a full right to a person with a disability. Okay, so in the next slide, we see what access to justice in the CRPD establishes. As for a person with a disability to access to justice, there should be reasonable accommodation to enable him or her to act in any process or in any role within the judicial procedures. Full accessibility should be ensured. We're talking about accessibility in the physical, but also the information and communications environment, but also the procedures. That is, if procedures need to be modified in order for a person with a disability to participate, then they have to be. And something that is very important is that state is obliged or has the obligation to train justice officials in relation to the rights of persons with disabilities. In the next slide, we come to another very complex topic that is in Article 14 of CRPD, liberty and security of the person. So here, Article 14 basically establishes that no person with a disability should be deprived of his or her liberty based on his or her disability. So there should be legal provisions that prohibit this kind of deprivation of liberty. There is also an issue about persons who are considered dangerous, and that is the reason why they are detained or deprived of their liberty. So the criteria of dangerousness of a person should be reviewed in those legislation that allow for this kind of detention or deprivation of liberty. And of course, if a person is deprived of his or her liberty, it should be on the basis of a criminal procedure. I'm sorry, I'm trying to translate things in my mind. Okay, thank you. I'm going to sit down. In this article, something that is very important is that forced institutionalization of persons with disabilities is also considered deprivation of liberty. And I know that this still happens in most of the countries of the world, and I just was speaking last night with somebody who was telling me that in Taiwan that is not the exception. So of course it is not easy to just transition from having all those persons with disabilities in the institutions to bring them out. So basically when we think of the institutionalization plans for any country, we link this article with Article 19, which is independent living and being included in the community. So if we want to deinstitutionalize persons with disabilities who have been long-term institutionalized, of course we have to make a plan. And a lot of schemes for independent living have to be set up, and they usually cannot be done immediately. So that is why a plan is needed with concrete stages and timeframes. This Article 14 about liberty and security of a person also provides for due process, the guarantees for due process when a person is subjected to a criminal procedure. And the need for accessibility in detention places, where in those cases where persons with disabilities have been deprived of their liberty due to a legal procedure, a criminal procedure. Okay, so in the next slide, we see another of the provisions that CRPD includes, and that is protecting persons with disability against torture and other human and degrading treatment. So according to this new, this new CRPD standards, some of the treatments that have been administered to persons with disabilities are considered torture. For example, the use of net bedding in psychiatric facilities or similar institutions, which is still widespread in many countries of the world. Physical and chemical restraints, especially if they are very prolonged. Electroconvulsive therapy is considered as an act of torture. And prolonged isolation, where we're talking of many hours or even days. We have even testimonies of persons being placed under isolation for weeks even. Of course, this is very inhuman and degrading, but it can amount to torture. So in order to protect persons with disabilities against these kind of acts, especially in those institutions where these things happen, supervision mechanisms should be set in place, supervision by an independent mechanism. I'm not sure if Taiwan has one. You can brief me on that later. But it is important that some kind of independent authority, a supervising authority, monitor the situation of institutions where persons with disabilities are placed to prevent these kind of acts from happening. So in the next slide, we go into living independently and being included in the community. So what I mentioned about Article 14 and deinstitutionalization of persons with disability, that a plan should be drafted and implemented. Of course, that means that a lot of community-based services have to be put into place, and schemes for personal assistance and other supports that will enable persons with disabilities to actually live independently. This article also refers to allowing or enabling persons with disabilities to be able to choose their housing scheme and what kind of accommodation they want to live with or with whom they want to live with. So, of course, a lot of community services are necessary, but as yesterday's discussion there are other aspects of social attitudes, and education have also to be changed in order to persons with disabilities, in order to enable persons with disabilities to live effectively in the community. In the next slide, we talk about the right to family. And this means we're talking basically that persons with disabilities have to be guaranteed their sexual and reproductive rights. And in the policies and legislation, there has to be a review to eliminate all legal provisions that establish any kind of provision to persons with disabilities to marry and to found a family. Persons with disabilities also have a right to retain their fertility. When yesterday the issue about forced sterilization was raised, this, of course, has a lot to do with whether people want to retain their fertility because they wish to have children of their own. Of course, forced sterilization based on the disability should be prohibited. And parental rights of persons with disabilities, both mothers and fathers with disabilities, should be protected, but because there is also this idea that persons with disabilities are not fit to be good parents, and in some parts of the world, when they do have children, their children are usually taken away from them. And also, this includes the right of children with disabilities to live with their own families and not to be abandoned or placed in institutions. So in the next slide, we go to the right to education. And I know this is a very complex topic, and the committee is at this moment drafting a general comment on the right to education. And one of the key aspects that we want to point out in that general comment is that inclusive education is a human right. So this I would say would upscale the category of the right to education to the right to inclusive education. That would mean that states then will have the obligation to provide for inclusive education. And it will not be acceptable for other types of education not being inclusive to be considered as the right to education, basically. So inclusive education is not a synonym of integrated education. And special education, which I would say is still the major form of education for persons with disabilities around the world, does not guarantee the quality of education that other students without disabilities receive. And it's basically a type of segregated education. So yesterday when Professor Wharton was talking about whether special education should be banned or not, I was thinking, well, yes. Well, yes, as a right to education. It could exist, of course, but not as the right to education put into place. We have to be clear that inclusive education is now a human right. Okay, so the next slide, we talk about work and employment. I think yesterday the panel about this topic was very thorough, so I'm going not to repeat the same issues, but basically persons with disability should have access to employment in an open market with equal opportunities as other persons without disabilities. That means that discrimination in work and employment should be prevented and eliminated in all stages of work and employment, from starting with the recruitment process and, of course, during employment, and in other aspects like becoming part of a union or when retiring. Reasonable accommodation should be a key aspect that enables persons with disabilities to be employed. So this, of course, reasonable accommodations is not only covering the right to work and employment, but it's I think it has been more elaborated in this field or in this right because it refers to a public domain of the right. But I just want to make clear that reasonable accommodation does apply for other rights also in the private aspect of life of persons with disabilities. We are also talking about equal salary for equal work and providing continued training for workers with disabilities. Okay, so in the next slide, we go to adequate standard of living and social protection. The committee has interpreted some of the provisions in CRPD as, for example, including persons with disabilities in mainstream poverty reduction schemes. As you all probably know, persons with disabilities, of course, have a higher rate of poverty conditions, and among the population living in poverty conditions, there is, of course, a higher rate of disabled persons. And when we talk about social protections, they should be accessible to persons with disabilities not only in the urban settings, but also in rural settings, which is more complicated to set up, of course, but also persons with disabilities living in rural areas have more difficulties than persons with disabilities in the urban areas. And another key aspect of this right is that the provision or the implementation of this right should also consider mitigating the impact of disability in poverty. As you probably all know, having a disability does necessarily imply living at a higher cost. So, of course, that has an impact on the living standards of persons with disabilities. Also, the need to provide assistance to families having members that are persons with disabilities. In the next slide, we see political rights which are provided for in Article 29 of CRPD. So there should be no restrictions to the right to vote of persons with disabilities. And that means that even if many persons with disabilities are still under substituted decision regimes, that is, their legal capacity has been limited in partially or totally, the right to vote should not be denied even under these conditions. Of course, this includes the need for accessibility in all voting processes, voting polls, but also all the information related to electoral processes. And it also includes the need to ensure that people with disabilities can effectively participate in political environments, for example, political parties, or in other kind of organizations. And the importance that persons with disabilities can become public officials, of course, in consistency with their professional skills. In the next slide, this topic about data collection and the need to implement data collection disaggregated by types of impairments, of course, other factors like gender, age, and other categories like rural and urban, indigenous, etc. Statistical instruments should be implemented with a rights perspective when collecting data about persons with disabilities. Of course, statistical instruments collect data of all types depending on what, who is implementing that tool and what the information will be used for. But when we talk about statistical tools like census and population census and surveys regarding the rights of persons with disabilities, they should be implemented with the rights perspective. So now in the next slide, we go to national implementation and monitoring. And I think this is also a very important issue. Article 33 of CRPD addresses two key aspects, and one is the appointment of one or more focal points in charge of disability policies within the governmental institutions, and of course the possibility to establish a coordinating mechanism between those focal points. And the other aspect is the appointment of independent mechanism to monitor the CRPD implementation at country level. And this independent monitoring mechanism ideally should comply with the Paris principles. And in both mechanisms, both the implementation mechanism and the monitoring mechanism, persons with disabilities should be included through consultations, but also during the processes. This is a very important aspect that has to be considered in all articles of CRPD. And I would finish with this message about empowerment. We need persons with disabilities to be empowered, and their organizations also, with all the rights enshrined in CRPD. And of course, this phrase that Professor Nagase already cited yesterday, nothing about us without us, is I would say, like a synthetic way of saying that we need to know what's happening and have a say in what is going to be decided, either through policies and legislation or through programs, plans, and all the stages that the institutions and the governments implement in order to comply with CRPD. So I think I have a few minutes still, so I will leave it for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, for your inspiring talk. So we have 10 minutes left, and any questions? Welcome. Yes.
Thank you. This is Nagase. Thank you very much for your very informative and very powerful presentation. As I understand, you are in an individual capacity. That's why maybe you couldn't say it. But you have been playing a leading role as the vice chair of the committee, an important member of the bureau. So I really appreciate your participation today. And I have two questions. That is, first, now you are working on, the committee is working on the third general comment on women and girls with disabilities. From this process, what will be the main points of the upcoming general comment on women and girls? That is the first question. And the second and the last question is, as Japan and also Taiwan are preparing its initial report, from your experiences as country rapporteurs for different countries and as a member of the committee, what kind of advice do you have for the initial report from the government? And also, if you have any advice for a civil society for the preparation of the alternative or shadow reports, I would be really grateful. Thank you.
Should I respond or wait for more questions?
No, you can just respond.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Professor Nagase, for your questions. In relation to general comment on women and girls with disabilities, it has three main focuses. That's the three main topics that were identified by the working group, of which I am one of the members. The CRPD committee held a half day of general debate on this topic, and with all the contributions that the committee received, both written and also during that half day of general debate, three main topics were identified, and those are the three topics that are being elaborated in the general comment, and those are discrimination, multiple and intersectional discrimination. The second topic is violence against women and girls with disabilities, and the third topic is sexual and reproductive rights. So a draft has been circulated a couple of times already. The last time was this past summer for comments and contributions from DPOs. Although the consultation has been closed, I think the draft's still in the website of the committee. For those of you who are interested in learning more about its in what direction the general comment is moving to, you can go through that draft and take a look. So the second question about the initial report and shadow reports coming from Japan. Well, first of all, I want to say that the committee has guidelines on the preparation of state reports. And of course, states should follow these guidelines to prepare their initial reports. But basically, we talk about what the state has been advancing since ratifying CRPD. So there are provisions that are easier to comply with than others, we know, of course. But even if states are having difficulties with some articles, if they are just starting to put into place some kind of strategy or just drafting legislation, still that is an advancement, and the committee, of course, is interested in learning about those things. And something that the committee does appreciate is that the initial report of the state should be as comprehensive as possible. And then regarding shadow reports, I think that it is very important that people who draft shadow reports be independent. I think that is one of the key issues. And as committee members, we actually don't really know whether shadow reports come from independent entities or not. We just have references, of course, and we rely on those references that are very important. But that is one key issue. And then the other one is that the state report might focus and address some topics, but usually persons with disabilities and DPOs have other concerns or have more pressing concerns than those addressed in the state report. So the committee does appreciate hearing the voices of persons with disabilities in those shadow reports. So because of time, that would be my main recommendation.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm Yue Qingzhou from local, and I like your presentation very much, and it's very clear. And here my concern is just related to Professor Nakashi's questions. I'd like to know the relation between CEDAW, C-E-D-A-W, CEDAW and the CRPD, because as I know your position in the UN. So I'd like to know the UN, from the UN level, how these two committees working together. And then, because here my concern is, for example, I have read some kind of article mentioned about that the CEDAW, okay, does not get the reasonable accommodation included in their advocacy. But however, kind of I'm not sure the document, maybe also from the UN Council Committee, and also mention about some kind of issues like culture, transportation, and the communication, those kind of issues. Okay, need to put included in the CEDAW for the movement for people, for women with disabilities. So I'd like to know what's your idea, because now in Taiwan, here for our CEDAW movement is quite successful, but not in CRPD. So for your idea, what's your opinion, and also share the kind of your experiences for these two committees work together at the UN level. Thanks.
Thanks for that question. Yes, CRPD committee and CEDAW committee have been getting closer ever since the drafting of the General Comment on Women and Girls with Disabilities started 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. So I would say that maybe at the beginning, CEDAW committee was slightly familiar with disability rights, but there are some very specific concerns relating to women and girls with disabilities that CEDAW committee had not considered. And some forms, for example, when we talk of violence against women and girls with disability, there are some very specific forms of violence against women and girls with disabilities that women with no disabilities are not subjected to. But then also, there are other issues that have not been included in the general comment on women and girls with disability, but have created, at the beginning of the debate, some controversy with the CEDAW committee, and that is relation to abortion. CEDAW committee, of course, has a very strong position in relation to protecting the right to abortion in those countries where it is legal. But CRPD committee will not, of course, in any way contradict that position. However, the committee, CRPD committee, has expressed in 2 or 3 concluding observations to state parties. I remember 2 now, but I think it's 3. Expressing that disability-based abortion should be considered discrimination. Of course, it's a position not against abortion, but against disability-based abortion. It's, of course, a very controversial issue. The committee has expressed it and has stood up to it, to the position. But CEDAW committee, after the first time that this was mentioned in one of the concluding observations, it was actually when the committee reviewed China, mainland China. A concluding observation regarding this topic was drafted, and since then, this is year 2012. Since then, CEDAW committee has gone closer to CRPD standards, and them and us, the CRPD committee, have almost reached an agreement that disability-based abortion is discriminatory.
Thank you, Sylvia, for your sharing. We will close the section now because we don't have any more time. And we will have a break time. If you still have some questions, you are very welcome to come to Sylvia. Okay, thank you.